Hi students, welcome back to Soc/Com 275, backed by popular demand. My popular demand, we have Professor Joe Marchia here today to talk to us about internet culture, starting with a conversation about cancel culture. Welcome, Professor Marchia. Do you have any opening remarks?
No, should be a good discussion. I'm excited to talk about it in a nuanced way, because it's in the news all the time. But the discussions are usually very one-sided.
Yeah, the discussions are usually like, no, yes.
Yeah, it's very yes or no, and we'll have a more nuanced discussion.
It's very polarizing. All right, so let's try to parse it out into some more sensible ways to talk about this. All right, so the first question is, why are we talking about this? Beyond that, it's covered on the news a lot. I've been thinking about a theoretical reason to do so, to think about not only cancel culture or whatever that is, but internet culture more broadly. And I have been wondering if this idea can be analogous to Marx's theory of the base and superstructure. So since Professor Marchia is a theory expert, I wanted to start by asking you, if you don't mind, to describe to us what the base superstructure theory is.
Yes. So I'll have to start with kind of what it is literally, then we could sort of figure out what the analogous portion would be. So the in Marx sort of distinguishes two uh, other parts or processes of society. The first one being the base, which would be the means of production, the mode of production, right? The ways in which goods are produced, right? And the way that's tied into the economic structure of a society. And the second part, the superstructure, would be basically all the other parts of society, the politics that come out of that, the law, the culture, the art, the conversation, right? So he sort of sorts the two different things that happen in society into these two parts, and he says mostly that what we see is that the superstructure, right, all the things, all the politics that come from that, all the art, all the culture, is a sort of reflection of what's going on with the base, right? So he takes this sort of um, economic focus and uses it to explain, right, the way the superstructure functions is it's sort of a reflection of that, and it also keeps that going, right? It justifies that in a certain way. It reinforces it, right? So sort of this way, there's two different parts of society. One's a sort of reflection of the other and reinforces it.
Right. And there's like a debate between academic and non-academic scholars of Marx about whether, only the base influences the superstructure or the superstructure can also influence the base. Is that right?
Yes. So sort of, well, yeah. A lot of people that work in the Marxist tradition would say that, the economic conditions are sort of the only real place in which change happens, right? All the arts and culture can't really affect it so much because it's just a reflection of that. And then you have other people who would say, okay, maybe it does reflect it in some way, but also that superstructure, the culture could also affect the base, right? There's some way in which culture could affect economic conditions, right? Maybe they're not as strong, right? But there could be some sort of, you know, two-way street between the two.
Right. So it's basically a mutually reinforcing relationship. To what extent which influences which depends on who is talking about this. So why are we starting with this conversation to talk about cancel culture? Well, I thought we could, apply this theory and not directly apply, because again, any orthodox Marxist, if they watch this, they're going to be like, this is ridiculous, please make it stop. So I have to be very careful that I'm trying to think about it as a concept, right? As a mode of communicating an idea to you. So think about this concept of a base and a superstructure that are mutually reinforcing, right? So let's try to apply that to the internet. So if we had an analogous theory, a base and superstructure theory, analogous to the internet versus offline life, how could we conceptualize that, right? So I had this idea of the online superstructure reflecting the offline base. And that is something that can apply to pretty much any time in society, but especially right now in 2020, we are living in an extra online world, right? Extra online life. Like the public sphere or like the social sphere is mostly happening online on Zoom and these other channels. But that is just a hyper-real reflection of offline society where our like physical bodies and selves are located, and actual social processes like inequality or the protest, for example, any kind of like social dynamics and change and social like influence happens offline in real time in our like three-dimensional selves. But the way I wanted to like think about how the base superstructure idea can apply to online offline life is when it comes to making change in society, right? This class is going to be focused a lot on how to use the internet for social movements and how it has been used for social movements. And we haven't gotten there yet, but that's sort of the second half of the class. So thinking about change and how change occurs, if we conceptualize the internet as the online superstructure, the place where like culture and politics and interactions between people in the public spheres happen, that represents the offline base where the real life sort of, right? I'm not talking about only economic base, but everything that transpires in the world outside of the internet. What I'm trying to think about is, if we want to change the real world, to what degree can online superstructure influence? Because obviously the internet is a microcosm of the real world, and the offline base influences the internet to a great extent. Does the reverse of that also work? Like, can we and to what extent can we influence the real world by influencing change at the superstructure level? Does that make sense to you, Professor Marchia? What would you say about that?
Yeah, I mean, it's a similar. It's a it's an analogy because, right, it's the question about how something that might just be a reflection of the other, right? We can think of online as sort of, a lot of people say it's just a reflection of whatever's happening in the real world, right? But the question is sort of, it's a similar kind of debate in that, can things that are happening on the internet, right, also impact real life, right? If it's just a reflection, it can. But if there's some sort of interplay between the two, well, then maybe there's some way that it can.
Yeah, exactly. That's a very good point. Sorry, not COVID. Yeah, the question of the day is like, is there a way that it reflects back on real life? And so with that, I wanted to, also, our part of our assignment for this class is to build a new internet culture that, would ideally look like what we want our offline reality to look like. So, when we are creating this assignment together, it helps to think about whether it's just a project about the internet or it's a project that reflects back on real society, right? So I hope that this conversation we have today will help us all think through this project of developing norms for internet citizenship that reflect what we desire as collective human society, right? So let's start, because the topic of the week is cancel culture, or canceling as some people call it. ContraPoints, the video you all watch, she refers to it as canceling. Let's start by talking about what is cancel culture, and why do conversations about cancel culture produce so much polarization?
You want me to try and...
Yeah,
Okay.
I mean, tell us what you think, and then we can maybe...
Yeah, so I think part of why the conversation's really difficult and a lot of times not nuanced is because of this question of what is it? And I think the answer to that question is, it's sort of a lot of things, or a lot of things of different magnitude. But basically, I would say what people refer to when they talk about cancel culture is that you have people who say something or do something that's considered beyond the realm of what's acceptable, right? In a moral sense, right? People who do something unacceptable, and as a result of that, there's different forms of accountability or punishment that happen in response to it, right? So you have things that could be as small as getting critiqued online, right, or as big as being sort of blacklisted from getting a job, losing your job, right, and any sort of matter of thing in between, right? So essentially, when people talk about it, they're talking about, right, usually online, this is where it happens, right? Because a lot of times this deals with, that's where the conversation sort of happen. This happens usually in the media, which is very online, or a lot of times on social media, which is obviously completely online, right? So when people talk about cancel culture, it's sort of hard to figure out what the culture part of that is, right? Because it encompasses so many different things. But I think in a nutshell, also, canceling is it's a broad spectrum of things. But essentially, I think it's this whether or not it's new is a question, right? But it's this sort of response to what happens when someone does or says something that's considered outside the realm of what's sort of morally acceptable, and as a result, some sort of um, a response happens that's either holding them accountable or having some sort of penalty for doing so.
Yeah. So the range of definitions for canceling is quite broad, and when people have a conversation about this, they are just talking about it in broad strokes and talking about cancel culture in very heated ways, as though it's this one thing and it's either right or it's wrong. And I think part of the problem with this conversation is that the whole concept is really, really broad, and it's not actually referring to just one thing, right? So that's part of what you were saying. So some of the different, dimensions of canceling can be like a celebrity does something that is morally reprehensible, like is involved in a Me Too case, and then people use the internet as a platform of their voice to hold that celebrity accountable so that they can be removed from positions of power and hopefully, be given some sort of ramification for their for indiscretion. Wow, thanks. So that's one level, and I think in that one level, it's like giving power to the people. And on the other level, you have your comments section of the internet, where some random person that you don't know and will never see again says something inflammatory, and then it turns into sort of like this like group exercise in the intention is to teach them, but it sometimes turns into some toxic behaviors that I want to get into. So this is to say, this is a conversation about how sometimes canceling is good and sometimes it might be a little bit toxic. So it's not this one thing, right? But I wanted to start by asking you about the ContraPoints videos. So ContraPoints is also a controversial figure, and I know we have been engaging with controversial figures in this class because those are the people that are talking about the internet and internet culture, and so that's where we have to go. And she clearly has a lot of flaws, and she reflects her own flaws and talks about them in this video that we watched, but she also shows us the sort of like dark side almost of collectively coming at a single individual, and versus like this, she talks about the like tropes of cancel culture, and some of them I don't think are super valid, but others are actually quite interesting and they speak to some interesting points. So I just wanted to say, like, why should we listen to ContraPoints on this, or why is her take interesting? And after all, she's a famous content creator with a lot of money, so why did I make my students watch this? Or like, what do you think? Why is ContraPoints' voice interesting in this specific case?
Well, I think for a few reasons. First, because she's someone that's sort of been in her career as she's a YouTuber, but she has a sort of philosophical or sociological take on these things, and she's been engaging with online communities, right, and the internet as part of her work generally. I mean, that's sort of been the bulk of what she's studied and researched, and she's spent a lot of time looking at different ways in which sub-communities or social movements or different patterns of interaction on the internet have taken place, right? So she has that sort of knowledge. She's done sort of her own research in this, and then on the flip side, in the video, it talks about sort of her own experience of then being a figure who was, in some way, quote unquote, canceled. I mean, not even so much her words as much as other people saying that
Yeah.
she's canceled, right? And in her case, I think it's interesting because she's able to recognize that. Well, she's able to recognize a few different things, right? That she's, in her case, the canceling is sort of at the lower end of being critiqued, right? And that's obviously different from being fired, right? But at the same time, also this critique is right. She's seen it apply to people in ways that are helpful, but she also makes the case for what happened to her as being sort of an unproductive version of this, right? In which she sort of found herself, you know, having these critiques, but any sort of response or any sort of attempt to rectify whatever transgression she did or explain herself, right, was sort of met with more resistance, right? So she has sort of this personal experience, and she also has a sort of broader knowledge of trends that are happening with internet conversations, and she sort of reaches a nuanced conclusion where she's not, right, even though she's had this experience, she's not sort of painting whatever cancel culture is with this sort of broad brush stroke of saying that everything that could be considered canceling has been bad or it's been good, right? She sort of dissects it in this way that sort of speaks to the nuances, right? And she also talks about, even though she talks about her problems with her own experience, right? She's also able to recognize a lot of the ways that it's also been used as a method to hold powerful people accountable at the same time.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's a feature length one person's video essay about a topic, so that's something unique we get there is nuance, and like you mentioned a couple of times, that's something missing from this conversation. And as somebody who has personally experienced the spectrum of canceling, as she calls it, she is able to both like give us a perspective from somebody that feels that they are sort of caught in the middle of this storm, but also from sort of like a philosophical perspective. And so I thought that would be interesting to focus on her. And watching this video, like sometimes I find myself nodding along, and other times I'm like, maybe not. But there are two of her cancel tropes that I think we can come back to throughout this conversation that we're going to have. The first is the transitive property of cancel culture, where one can become toxic via association to people that have been deemed, immoral by society. And there is the dualism property trope that she talks about that I think is also going to be relevant, which is the idea that from watching people or like looking at people's comments or engagement with the internet, we can, we try to at least conclusively conclude that they're either good or they're bad, right? There's this like duality of quality and moral quality that people occupy, and they can either be good people or they can be bad people. And the way we then exercise collective like punishment or judgment is based on this like where do people fall in this dual characteristic of, are they good, certainly good, without question good, or are they bad, like certainly bad, without question bad? And so that's something we do as people that participate on the internet. So I'm just pointing those out, and I would like to come back to them throughout, but is there anything you would want to say about those tropes for now?
Yeah, I think that, right, so when looking at society, right, there's always one thing that's been constant, right, even looking before the internet and cancel culture, is that there's always been sort of people that are considered beyond the pale of what's morally acceptable and have been considered sort of bad. But I think what's sort of new when we look at the internet and cancel culture is how widely that's applied now, right? So you do have this sort of every sort of public figure sort of gets assigned into this good or bad, right? Are they canceled or are they not canceled, right? And that's where I think it goes beyond just sort of critique to also looking at sort of how this sorts people into one category or another, right? Canceled or not canceled, right? Which is different than sort of allowing someone to persist and have a sort of public reputation that could be messy, right? It could be sometimes they don't have, maybe they have some good stuff and some bad stuff. Maybe they have, a lot of good stuff and one thing they did wrong. And maybe there's someone that also, has done a lot wrong, but maybe for other reasons is not quite, the worst figure in the world. And I think this sort of, this dualist trope is something that's very interesting. And I would say something that's pretty new and how widely it's applied on the internet.
Yeah, and it's also interesting because we have these concepts of good and bad, and we've had this since the dawn of time, but now we're assigning characteristics to people of good and bad, often based on very tiny snippets of their persona that we see, like almost a flash of like a whole longitudinal three-dimensional life, right? But on the other hand, I mean, so canceling mostly happens on the internet, and we are trying to talk about the internet, but of course there's like offline things that happen that result in the canceling of people that should be canceled. So again, I'm thinking about like celebrities who engage in reprehensible behavior that are then held accountable online. That's a different thing. But when we're talking about like, very much extremely online, when we're like on Twitter or when we're on the comment section of YouTube or Reddit or whatever it is, there, when this sort of public canceling of one another occurs, it's sort of dualism on a completely whole new level, where we have decided the moral characteristic of somebody we literally don't know. We have no idea who they are as people. So it feels so like bizarre to then assign these like sweeping dualistic moral characteristics to
Yeah. Oh no, sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Oh. Yeah, but again, but then I also feel compelled to point out, because this conversation gets thorny, that if you have a figure like Harvey Weinstein, I think everyone's pretty comfortable assigning bad to. So like at the extreme poles, it's like we're not necessarily saying, oh, but the Harvey Weinstein's a gray area, not that necessarily, but looking at it on a case-by-case basis, sometimes you might look at a figure and it's hard to think of an example off the top of my head, but right, it's how widely applied this sort of good or bad is, right? Not to just the absolute monsters, but to people that maybe have a messy or complicated reputation or persona.
Yeah, and it's also like on some level, I don't even care about like public figures, like whatever, they have money and and fame, and a lot of the times, they can be toxic, and they get a lot of material reward for occupying these like powerful positions, and even if like a kind of okay like public persona gets caught in like the canceling fire, like to me, I don't see that as that big of a concern. What concerns me is when we engage in the same sort of like labeling towards ourselves, like towards the everyday person, the like person with 400 Twitter followers who's just trying to be seen, right? Like that's the application of these tropes at that level with the same sort of intensity can really produce a lot of negative emotions that are then reflected back onto the internet. And we're going to get to all of this, but let's start by why is canceling good? On some level, canceling is really good, and that's what you were getting at, right? There are these like monstrous figures that need to be held accountable, and they don't get held accountable. And I assigned this article that I meant to send you, but I forgot, by Sarah Abraham on Vice, where she talks about how canceling is good because it is the only way in which people have had power against the influential other, and in many cases, like the influential other, the powerful figure, doesn't even really get held accountable, right? This is the bare minimum of accountability they're subjected to, and even if they are subjected to that, they don't ultimately have like serious consequences. Like somebody like Aziz Ansari, for example, was involved in some really like gross behavior, but then he was sort of publicly absolved very quickly because it was a persona that people liked because they saw him on Parks and Recreation and that associated with good feelings for them or whatever, right? So for these kinds of figures that are sort of almost like free from any sort of accountability for their behavior. Cancel culture is almost the only thing holding them to any behavioral moral standards that are respectable in society. What do you think of that?
Yeah. Um, yeah. So the accountability part of it is, if we were going to look at the positives, you're absolutely right that, a lot of uh, powerful people were finally held accountable by, essentially ordinary people online because, they wouldn't have been otherwise. I mean, usually these people have a lot of money and make a lot of money for other people, right? And the media, would maybe sometimes call people out, but not always, right? And usually not really good at accountability, or at least any sort of accountability that reflects the demands of the general public, right? So you do sort of see, part of what's new when people talk about cancel culture is also this positive aspect of, right? Like, part of why this feels very new is because you have ordinary people having a voice in these things and sort of determining what responsibility they want for their public figures to have, and what they, if they find the behavior unacceptable, they can work to remove people from positions of power. And the Me Too movement being a good example of, people who had predatory behavior, which may not have even um, necessarily been something that could be even legally sort of uh, what's the word, legally, they couldn't be tried necessarily for various reasons that don't meet a legal standard, but still it was understood they had engaged in this behavior, right? And they were sort of protected from having from facing justice for it, and so ordinary people were able to do that.
Yeah.
And that's something that's very new.
Yeah, it's really cool. And that's something even bigger than just this, right? It's like ordinary people having a voice and power is sort of the new and cool thing about the internet more broadly. I mean, in the past, we would have to trust entirely to like on the like mainstream, like top down media to do anything. So imagine, I mean, not even imagine, we know like all of these like famous influential figures were like getting away with really crappy stuff. I mean, Bill Cosby, right? It was not like one day CNN came and like just told us, oh my God, Bill Cosby is a toxic misogynist who has engaged in, I don't want to get into triggering language, but obviously like that's something that we couldn't trust the mainstream media to give to us. And then once like the internet came about and this information became sort of more like publicly like dismantled, then there was this collective demand to try out that case and then actually turn it into something. And I think that just goes to show a very powerful thing. And it's not even limited to the US, right? So in China, the Me Too movement is really quite powerful. In fact, a few years ago, people use like the internet and know that in China we have the Great Firewall, so people don't even have the same ability to freely access internet freely. We can talk about freedom, but the way people use internet in China is very different. So Me Too activists had to get around a lot of like these like censors and a lot of these firewalls to build this very powerful movement that resulted in a famous like TV figure being held accountable for their behavior for the first time. And not only that, but there was like a change at the legislative level. So when we think about social movements and their success, we want to ask, was there a legal socio-political change, right? An official change of some kind that we can point to. In China, because of this case, it became legal for the first time for women to sue people for sexual harassment. So that is a very powerful use of what we're calling cancel culture, right? But then, okay, let's talk about this definitional issue a little bit more, because I think part of our job here today is to really parse out these different concepts that are being glommed into one thing. So, when we think about this good canceling or like power to the people, how can we define that differently or better? In your thoughts?
What I think are sort of the examples of good counseling, or what?
how we can frame it almost, right? Examples are good, but also like what's a good way to frame it and not call it cancel culture? So if we can get out of these conversations today, getting rid of the concept of cancel culture and appropriately tagging the different aspects of it as they are, then we don't need cancel culture as a concept anymore, right?
Right. Yeah. So I think when you read people sort of say there is no cancel culture, I mean, those arguments usually hinge on is that, you know, the good canceling is really just accountability,
Yeah.
right? So that's really all this is. This isn't some, you know, um, these aren't things that are new or dangerous or scary. These are actually just an example of justice being doled out from the people, and people that sort of say that this is a good thing, right? What they're sort of saying is that this is this is a justice movement, that people can now be the ones to adjudicate this, hold people accountable, right? This is an accountability mechanism that's finally in the hands of people rather than powerful figures to sort of broker that justice for them, right? Because often we see, right, the Me Too example being a good case study of this is that the legal system does not, at least the way it functions in the real world, does not hold powerful people accountable for a whole bunch of reasons, right? I mean, from patriarchy all the way to class differences, right? And so as a sort of as a justice social movement, right? That's one way that you could sort of think about the good side of cancel culture, quote unquote.
Yeah, it's like accountability and justice social movement. I like that. Social justice, but social
I
movement.
just like reversed. It's not even a new term.
How about like social movement justice, SMJ instead of SJW? I don't know. Well, like whatever. Accountability, I think, is a good term for what good canceling is, right? Like it's ultimately like people having power and accountability, which is this beautiful thing that is only facilitated by the internet, and so that's one side of it. The one side of it is people getting power against influential figures, doing things that they shouldn't be doing, whatever. We talked about this. So before we go into the toxic side of what is called canceling and how to define it, is there anything else you want to add about good canceling or accountability and, power?
Yeah, well, just to talk about sort of the debate, right? Then when you have people who say that cancel culture is bad or toxic, then sort of the response is usually, well, yeah, because usually that critique comes from people, not always, but a lot of times in the media, from powerful people. People say, you're resisting this because you're resisting the accountability and the justice that's going to come the way for people that have done wrong, right? So that's usually the critique of the critique.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
again, this gets so complicated. There's so many different sides, but I think that just adds a little bit to that's one element of the discussion that we see.
Yeah. Yeah, no, absolutely. Actually, I think Counterpoint says this. She says, cancel culture is often just a conservative red herring for any time they want to justify bigotry and hate. And I think this is totally true, right? People do call out wolf, call out cancel culture, am I right? Just so they can get away with saying and doing things that are bigoted and harmful a lot of the times. This is totally true. And so we have to be careful to say that we are not aligning with that use of this term, because, if people are doing that, then they're at a level of not being concerned with moral behavior that I don't think that we can solve online. And that's going to be a lot of the conversation we'll have eventually today about like what we can and cannot do online in order to like achieve justice. But I think it is important that you just brought up that, yeah, a lot of the times people are using this term to sort of like use as a blanket statement to be able to say whatever they want and be as harmful or as toxic as they can. And we have to be careful and wary of that for sure. So with that, I want to transition into canceling is also a little bit toxic sometimes. And now I want to think about, and we can try to define this as we go along. canceling as online harassment of fellow human beings. And when I say fellow human beings, I mean people without power. So let's put aside all of the like famous people that have done horrible things, or even like famous content creators, even like ContraPoints. I feel bad for her after I watch her video because I care about mental health. But if you don't, then fine, right? Like whatever. She's a famous person with money, but let's forget about all of them and let's just think about harassment of fellow people, just other people on the internet, people like you and me and students maybe. So first, how do you think canceling in this context, in reference to general online engagement on Twitter or forums or comment section, how is that different from all of this like powerful accountability stuff?
Right. So I think it's in some way taking the sort of principles of, you know, it's an extraction of what's happening with the public figures, but applying it to each other, right? So this idea of this, the essentialism property, the transitive property of cancel culture, the dualism of it, and, you know, taking that all the way from powerful people to how we are treating each other, right? So looking at each other as good or bad, right? You know, your friends, your coworkers, or people on Facebook, right? Sort of seeing, you know, people get into political discussions all the time on social media, and it's often very inflammatory, and often, you know, often happens where it's name calling then, right? And often happens where it's, you know, people sort of being like, yeah, essentially labeling each other, right? I mean, anyone that's tried to have a political discussion online, sometimes it's productive, but if we're all honest with ourselves, more often than not, it's not very productive and actually very hostile and very personal. And I mean, you know, even if you haven't engaged in it, I'm sure you've seen it on your feeds, right? And so that's also a way in which really this, you know, maybe not the transitive property, but the dualist property, the essentializing property of whatever cancel culture is also, you know, taking out the cancel stuff, right? Taking out, you know, just looking at sort of the way people interact with each other online, the way people discuss things. And that's also something that's, you know, a function of social media that maybe we could even say is, you know, not usually talked about as an aspect of cancel culture, but is maybe an aspect of internet communication, right? And the way in which conflict on the internet happens. And often, not always, but very often around political conversations.
Yeah, absolutely. Exactly. I mean, it's not even cancel culture, it's just culture, internet culture, but we apply the tropes of canceling to these communications and online culture in a way that we maybe may not be aware of, and or maybe we're aware of and think it's okay. But today we want to talk about what does that accomplish. You know, part of the conversation is what are we trying to do when we engage in these conversations online? Who are we speaking to? What do we know? What do they know? We'll get to all of that, but let's start by talking about the transitive property and how it is applied to one another, right? So anyone can become toxic by association, and I find that quite amusing, honestly, because it's not funny in some ways. Because when we were watching the ContraPoints video, I was thinking, wow, like some of her colleagues, like these people that have worked with her, are really getting harassed and doxxed, and that's really horrible. But when you take that out and think about recent conversations about cancel culture that have come out online, I thought it was really quite funny that Noam Chomsky, who we're going to be reading in this class, like actually later this semester, we're going to be reading excerpts from Manufacturing Consent. And, you know, he's this influential scholar. So he signed a letter, the Harper letter, that was created by J.K. Rowling. And
it was not created by J.K. Rowling.
It was not? I thought, oh, it's just, see, I think it was her because it's associate. She was the like main like figure floating about in relation to that. Who was it created by? Can you describe this situation better than I'm doing right now?
I'm trying to remember the name. I don't remember the name of the person, but I think it was, I believe it was some sort of journalist that began crafting it. I should I didn't prepare. I don't remember his name. But he essentially crafted it and reached out to a bunch of different people that were asked to sign it. J.K. Rowling was the big headline because she was the most famous. I mean, you know, Noam Chomsky is also famous, but not, you know, not Harry Potter famous.
Yeah.
So she got really associated with the letter, but she didn't craft it.
Okay, right. See, I also just associated with her because this was a period of like quite high toxicity on the internet because J.K. Rowling has somehow really disintegrated in the time since I grew up reading Harry Potter. So she has recently become a TERF. I feel comfortable saying that. A TERF is a trans exclusionary radical feminist, people that call themselves feminists, but they are bigoted towards trans people and they don't accept trans rights, right? So these are like toxic feminists, and I'm only using that label in quotations because they identify as feminists, but I don't see them as feminists. Anyway, so J.K. Rowling was making some transphobic comments on on Twitter, and then this letter came out. So a bunch of people, including her, signed it, and she was already sort of in the middle of the heat for like making transphobic comments online. So then this letter became attached to her. So everybody started thinking about how, oh, J.K. Rowling is just trying to, get away with being transphobic, which I'm sure she was. But then it became that Noam Chomsky is suddenly a TERF. And what do you think about that? That's the transitive property, right? Noam Chomsky, who is a 90-year-old man, disintegrating probably on some level, just like thinking, oh yeah, sure, true, and just signing it. I don't know why he signed this piece of paper. I can't speculate on that. But then he became toxic by association and TERF by association. What do you think of that?
Yeah. Well, yeah. So a few things. I think, the reason it got very associated with her because she was the biggest name, and she was, you're right, in the middle of this. I don't know what to call it. I mean, scandal's not even quite the right word for it, but a huge public uproar about her comments about trans people. And so she got really attached to it as sort of the big figure, right? But you also had people like Noam Chomsky who signed it. But it was sort of read as Noam Chomsky defends J.K. Rowling, right? Even though they both signed it, I think, for very different reasons. I don't think Noam Chomsky was, he's 90 years old, he's writing about foreign policy, he doesn't know what J.K. Rowling said. If I had to guess, he doesn't know, right? But it's sort of, by the transitive property, he became sort of, it was seen as he's defending her, right? Or that he sort of stands for everything she stands for because they're co-signers on this letter, right? And so by that property, he also became sort of someone that, has also these toxic ideas. I think the reason Noam Chomsky signed it is because Noam Chomsky has generally been anti-censorship, and I mean, to a very, absolutist degree of complete free speech.
Right.
We can we can disagree on that opinion with him, but that's sort of always been his hard line, is that he's gone as far as to have because he's so critical of mainstream media, he takes sort of the extreme position that he thinks really everyone should be able to say everything, and obviously
Yeah.
agree to disagree,
Yeah.
right? But he's not necessarily signing on to what J.K. Rowling said, right? He's sort of signing on to her right to say it, but we have no idea what he thinks of her comments. It's not even clear if he's aware of them at all, right? But there's no way he knows. That he's sort of in his own world, right? But by this transitive property, it became that, Noam Chomsky signed on to J.K. Rowling's, transphobic letter or something, became this sort of way in which it was talked about. And that's, we could have another conversation about whether he signs it or not is good or bad, right? But the sort of way the conversation became, he
Right.
stands with her, is not quite the story, right?
Yeah, it just wasn't factual. I mean, you can disagree with his choice to sign that letter.
Absolutely, yeah. But
I know many like thinkers who don't like Noam Chomsky for various reasons. I think manufacturing consent is like one of the only like really good political economic analysis of the media. So we're going to be engaging with Chomsky in this class, regardless of what your view on him is. But the idea that this like 90-year-old man has any idea like what J.K. Rowling is saying on Twitter when he's like signed this document, and then the media narrative becomes about how Chomsky is now associated with these trans exclusionary radical feminist to me is just like such an extrapolation of the transitive property of cancel culture, which makes me laugh. I genuinely think it's funny that people were getting mad at Noam Chomsky for being a TERF because of this specific transitive property. So now I want to talk, so that's the transitive property, which can be on one level, on this level, really funny, but on another level, really problematic when like people are getting like doxxed and harassed and so that's the like dark side of the transitive property. The light side of it is joking about Noam Chomsky being a TERF. The dark side of it is like people getting fired from their jobs because they didn't know that somebody had said something unacceptable somewhere, and then they referred to them, and then that resulted in them like facing serious consequences, right? So let's talk now about the dualism trope that ContraPoints talks about, which is where, again, I've talked about this before, but like I'll refer to it again. We take two-dimensional snippets of someone and then label them good or bad. And I want to ask the question, do we become two-dimensional selves on the internet? Because there is a whole us offline, and then there is like the snippet online, right? Are other people two-dimensional? Like, are people, everything we see that they're doing online, is that the extent of who they are? Are people reduced to their like offense on comment section or Twitter? I'm just thinking that online posts represent, and I'm only talking about comment section, not about famous people. Online post represents only a tiny snippet of a whole person. And that person, talking about capitalist realism, which is where we are, focusing in this class, generally, theoretically, like every person we interact with on the internet, every person is a full three-dimensional individual who is also a victim to capitalist realism, just like we are, right? That is a fact that is true offline. So that is a fact of the base that I'm trying to assign to the offline reality here, right? So everybody victims of capitalist realism trying to engage and get away from isolation right now, especially in this isolated world, by engaging online. So when we engage with them in ways that are like very labeling, dualism, toxic good, like what we're doing is we are ostracizing individuals, like just everyday individuals to some degree, because we think, and it comes from a place of great intention, right? We think by doing that, we are somehow positively contributing to society, because at the end of the day, that is the desire. The desire is to teach this person to be better and make the world a better place on some like corny level, right? So the first question I want to ask is, are we going to solve imperialism, racism, capitalism, sexism on the comment section of the internet? Do you think that that's something that's a worthy endeavor for us as a collective species?
Are we going to solve it on the internet? I mean, no, but it's a question of what does the internet do? I mean, the internet could inspire things to happen offline, right? Is it going to happen on the comment section of the internet? Probably not. I mean, the comment section on the internet is, you're right, this sort of very small snippet. There's not a lot of really great conversation happening because it doesn't really allow for a lot of nuances, right? It's a two-dimensional snapshot, as you said, of a person, even of an opinion. I mean, comments are usually written pretty hasty. They're not, full thought out statements by activist groups, right? They're usually just kind of, just put out there very quickly. So certainly not in the comment section. I don't think that's going to be solved.
Yeah. No, I was just being snarky and trying to get at this, right? Like the idea that most people don't have full theoretical conceptualization of their opinions, right? Usually people's opinions are a pastiche and a mishmash of different things they believe. Like rarely, I'm not saying that nobody does, some people do, rarely do people just have like coherent ideologies that their opinions are coming from. So a lot of the times when they say something stupid or wrong, it's just, what do you think it is? Like, why do people feel the need to like have strong opinions on the internet? Why do you think that?
Um, that's a good question. Uh, I think I think having strong opinions is a lot of people's way of like trying to be heard on the internet. I mean, if you're going to post a comment on a video, if it's strongly worded, if it's somewhat even like maybe not inflammatory, but if it's somewhat provocative, right? It people get attention for it. It's a way of like reaching out to be seen in a way, and I think that that's you're right. A lot of people don't have fully formed political opinions, but they might go online and they might come up with their opinion right there, but then they're so strong and firm and really gung-ho about having this opinion, whether or not they've thought about it for more than a minute, right? Because I think it's people want to feel like there's some value to what they think, and there's value for them for sure, but they don't even necessarily value their own opinion, right? I think it's sort of a way of just wanting to be to feel seen and to feel heard, and you know
Yeah, it is a cry for connection. A lot of the times it's not only a cry for connection, it's a cry for approval. Like we want people to read or see us and see us as people that have important things to say, even if we don't, even if previous to this like comment thread that we got into with somebody, we didn't really care about this issue. Like we want to defend it with all of our might, because if we back off, then it means that what we had to say was not valuable, and so we're erased, and people are very afraid of being erased on the internet. And because everybody gets to have a voice on the internet, everybody is trying, right, to be heard, like you said. And it's almost like I feel a lot of compassion for that. I've been there, I've been on all sides of this and come out of it thinking, oh my God, like ultimately, like me personally, I'm just not going to try to engage with anything inflammatory on the internet, because I don't think that's how we make change. But certainly like the desire is understandable, like people want attention and love. Like it's as corny as that sounds, and when they don't get it, like it seems that their self-worth, their individual self-worth is tied to the validity of a single statement they made. And then if a bunch of people tell them that they're wrong, then that becomes this like super personal thing about like, oh, I'm wrong, something is wrong with me, not this thing that I said without thinking, but rather me as a whole person is deeply unlovable or unacceptable, or I can't be part of this group, sort of a thing.
yeah, and also a lot of internet content is sort of geared towards being provocative, right, in a way that people or stoking controversy,
Yeah.
right, in a way that people if they feel like they want to participate in something, right, it sort of also generates them being like, okay, well, I need to have a big strong opinion, I have to have a hot take on this hot take, and
Yeah.
it's sort of a cycle. And yeah, and people don't want to back down then, right, because backing down is not it does make people feel, at least to themselves, that yeah, like I didn't have something to say, I don't have something to say, I'm not important, right? But
Yeah.
if I keep if I stick firm and I'm stubborn in this opinion, right or wrong, then that means I am important.
Yeah. Yeah.
You could be wrong and be important.
Yeah, exactly. And so also our worth is not determined by the internet. That's the one thing, right? Ultimately, this is our 2D selves. I keep coming back to that because I think you said this once. There's a real like flattening of a personality that happens when we get tied into these like conversations, right? Like I've been in both sides of like this, like not calling it cancel culture anymore, online culture, like online communication, where like I've like said something that I regretted, but then I try to like back it off. And when I do that, I feel myself like just I lose all connection to myself as a whole person, right? Oh, I'm all like I'm various things. I'm a professor, I'm a wife, I'm a friend, I'm a person that does silly things, I'm a person with a Harry Potter tattoo, whatever I am. Like these like various aspects of my whole person, I forget. I just become, I am this opinion, I am a defender of this opinion, and my job is to do that. And then I go on for I've been in the past, again, this is something I've sworn off for reasons of mental health now, but in the past I've been engaged for days on end sometimes, and at the end of it, it's just like, wow, that thing really sucked all of my energy out of my body. And why did I do that? And it leaves me completely perplexed because I don't know why I did that. Like, why? What is the value of this kind of behavior? The online, the superstructure ramification is that, I made somebody else feel bad, somebody else made me feel bad, and then we forgot about it after a little while. The base ramification of that is that I got drained of a lot of energy that could have been invested elsewise. Even if I was just trying to like do some kind of social justice, I could do that in other ways using the internet itself. In that time, that would have been energy well spent rather than this flattening of the self. Like it's almost like I disassociate from my whole self and become this entity that is on the screen that is so flattened. Do you feel that?
Yeah, I think everyone's felt that, whether or not they've put it into so many words, right? Everyone's sort of had the frustration of being locked in this online debate and, just feeling like it's going in circles, but you can't stop, right? Because, yeah, also the fact that it's usually public, right? You feel like other people are seeing this, and I can't be the person that lost this argument, right? So people sort of double down.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So anyways, we need to like get towards wrapping this one up. So I have a couple more points that I wanted to touch. And the final one we're already touching on is mental health, and we'll come back to that. And then we'll transition into part 2, where we'll talk about how can we make internet a more mentally healthy place instead of this toxic 2D place, right? But first I wanted to talk about PR and forced sincere apologies, because ContraPoints talks about this, and Sarah Abraham also talks about this. All right. So Sarah Abraham says that people that are like celebrities who are like canceled, they are very quick to apologize because they're like saying false apologies, but they don't really mean it because they just don't want to be held accountable. And on that level, it's true. And ContraPoints actually says that this is part of the problem with canceling in this way, maybe partly because when people are just constantly forcing apologies, authenticity is lost from public engagement. And that reminds me of what Fisher says about all that solid melts into PR in this hyper real world, right? Like, so now people are just like not even going to learn. They're just going to say things because they don't want the mob like to come at them. What do you think of this idea?
Yeah, I think this is something that's happened over time, on the internet, where it sort of used to be someone would do something sort of cancelable, something that people didn't like. They would issue this PR public apology, and that would like sort of soothe the the backlash. But then of course people were right that this was often a PR move to try and avoid responsibility, and the same people would not really learn anything, right? Maybe, depending on how famous they were, probably not even write the statement themselves, right? But then the third stage of that is that you have people that do genuinely want to apologize, right? But then it can't help but come off as insincere, right? There's no way to tell on the internet the difference between someone's sincere apology and someone's PR, right? And especially if that apology, um, you know, feels motivated by people coming at them. I mean, there's no way to tell. Are you just trying to get people off your back? Are you trying to actually make amends? I mean, because the effect is the same, right? You want people to accept your apology, whether or not you mean it sincerely or not. And there's, again, going back to a 2D self, right? There's no way for someone to tell if you're sincere. But you also can't, it makes sense that people are skeptical also of public apologies, right? So it's hard. It's a miscommunication. And I mean, it seems impossible to know on the internet where everyone's sort of true emotional, sincere feelings are coming from, right? And so you
Yeah.
have sort of, there's this deadlock of, you know, apologies, public apologies. I mean, now it almost feels like they don't, you know, they're discounted very quickly. And on the one hand, that's because people are rightly skeptical of people just trying to avoid responsibility, but also you also imagine sometimes people are actually sorry, but it doesn't, no one can tell the difference there.
Yeah, and people can't even tell the difference. People aren't like so emotionally sophisticated that they know how they feel all the time. First of all, that's way too big of a responsibility, right? When somebody conducts a transgression, if they're not a total like bigot and shithead, like most likely they're part of them is like, oh, I kind of see where these people are coming from, and another part of them is like, I don't want to be collectively hated by the mob. So like they're like experiencing a mishmash of confusing emotions, and so it's impossible for them to even know if their apology is real. So then we really get into hyper reality, right? Then where is
Yeah.
the reality anymore?
Yeah, you're right. It could be both. And I mean, can you blame people for not wanting to be like really hated by a bunch of people online? I mean, it's sort of the natural response to it. And you're right, probably that everyone feels both at the same time.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah, I mean, some people don't. Some people, I mean, I'm not saying,
not everyone, right?
yeah,
It's
there
hard. Yeah.
are like toxic, bad, horrible people out there in the world. I'm saying there's no way for us to know just on online engagement who are good and capable of growth and learning, and who are just like straight up like bigoted and toxic and beyond hope. Like that's something we can't figure out. They can barely like figure out. We can barely figure out who we are, right, in this world. Like we're trying to like identify and know ourselves, like let alone like knowing another person. But so this is all like, again, now so far we've made two distinctions. First, good canceling, accountability of powerful figures. That's one side of cancel culture. So we don't need to talk about cancel culture anymore. The other side is the online culture that happens between people. So we're just going to call that online culture. And right now, what we're saying is online culture has sort of like consumed properties of cancel culture, or like this like accountability mechanism that is now being applied to one another. We're now using these tropes of like dualism most commonly, like and essentialism, and to an extent transitive property to each other on the comment section. So that is the internet culture, right? So now we have dissolved the need for a conversation about cancel culture, because we're either talking about accountability and power, which is good, or we're talking about internet culture, which needs a lot of doctoring. We really need to like spend time thinking about what this thing is, because not a lot of people have talked about it. Not a lot of people talk about it. We don't talk about how we participate in the internet as, and I've been extremely online in the past, and if any of my students have, you'll know. But even if you're not, even if you're just on Twitter, like how we engage with one another, how we communicate with one another, there's no like intellectual rigorous discussion around those things. So that's what we will get to in part two. But like I want to end by talking about a very important, well, two things. First, we're gonna get to manufacturing consent eventually, and there Chomsky talks about this concept of the enemy as part of the way in which the power structures maintain their power via the use of the media. So the media will, like, for example, Fox News will be like, the immigrants are taking your job, and then the immigrants become the enemy, rather than this hollowed economic system where there are no jobs, right? So that same thing ContraPoint says, we kind of start doing that to ourselves online. We create the enemy to sort of like point at for our like whatever we're feeling, in whatever ways we're feeling incomplete or unhappy. We're finding these enemies, we're pointing towards them collectively, and we are creating this enemy to distract from what is our goal? Like we're not like corporate power structures that get anything from creating these enemies. Then why do we do this? Why do you think we do this?
Uh, Good question. Why do you think we do this?
I mean, I don't know, to feel like we're a part of something, to feel right and moral. I don't know. I don't know. I wanted to ask you because I truly don't know why we create enemies on our internet culture.
Yeah. I mean, on some level, right? If we're going to bring it back to that, the analogy of base superstructure, right? Is it because is the internet so conflicted because, or does it have so much conflict because real life has so much conflict, right? On the you could one theory could be that our social life is deteriorating, right? We're isolated, not just with the pandemic, but with the way we live, with the way the economic system isolates us. We're alienated, right? And as a result, uh, we lash out, and it's easier, or the internet could facilitate a lashing out because, right, we have maybe these negative emotions. We're very antagonistic. We're very isolated from one another. And then if you know, take away someone's three-dimensional humanity, give them a two-dimensional form, it's very easy to lash out without even feeling bad. So it could be like a release for that, right? We don't think about the other person on the other side of the screen, and that makes it easy for us to get these negative emotions out without even, you know, having the sort of level of empathy we might normally, right? So it could be a sort of pressure valve for the, you know, real problems that are happening in our lives, right? Or and but maybe also that reinforces what's happening, right? Maybe that also in some way, right? It's the pressure valve for what's happening in our real life and our IRL life, and then also, you know, what's happening on the internet. We also see reflected in politics, right? I mean, you look at the alt right, you look at different, you know, online born social movements that, you know, maybe originated from all this, you know, problems happening in our real life, and then, you know, people take to the internet, and then it gets reflected back, and it could become something real, and it, you know, sort of reinforces each other.
Yeah. Yeah, and along the way, we forget about the most important thing that we have to keep in mind from a capitalist realism perspective is not giving each other more emotional trauma because everybody is already like saturated with emotional trauma, right? It's like psychological public stoning. I was thinking it's not something we would do. Like if somebody did something bad in offline society, if somebody was racist, like we would probably like try to like scold them or like, you know, hold them accountable in some way. But we wouldn't all sit around in a circle and then like throw rocks at them until like they died. There's a story about this that's quite graphic. But sometimes we do that online, right? We like forget, like, you know, for transgressions, we think that collective attacks are appropriate responses in a way that we would never think are okay offline, right? Offline, we're like, you know, we develop like, I don't know, offline, that's not, I'm not trying to say that like modes of like justice offline are anywhere near appropriate, but at least, you know, we would never group harass individuals for doing something bad unless it was really bad, right? Unless they did something like truly toxic. And even then, like how often do we see the equivalence of this group behavior online that we've all participated in? How often do we see that offline? Not very often, but yet online, like that one example. And trigger warning to students, trigger warning, talks of suicide coming up. But in the ContraPoints video, she talks about that one porn star who was so distraught by this that she committed suicide. And that's public stoning to death. And we would never do that offline. So why do we do that online? Like, you know, it's just such a bizarre, like disassociation from ourselves. Like it's a complete disassociation. And right now, you know, right now, many people are living alone during this pandemic. They are very susceptible to online shame because it can feel so real, like so personal. But the truth is, you know, anyone can go offline. It's possible at any moment. We can make that decision. We can go offline, but in that state, it feels emotionally impossible to close it down and go offline, and that can result in like serious emotional trauma and consequences. And I feel like I have been a part of a situation that could result in somebody feeling that level of emotional trauma. And I've sometimes been on the other side of that, like online being, I've been online since I was 11. So I've seen it all on the internet. And I think like that's something we have not thought about, this like psychological public shaming, public stoning. What do you think of that?
Yeah, I think you're right that there's that fine line between sort of, you know, a mass popular movement for justice, and then when it sometimes crosses that line into a sadistic tendency, right? And something it doesn't really have to do with justice, at least in the way it's doled out, right? I mean, if someone's sort of facing repercussions, you could still see people sort of piling onto them, right? And that's something that could, you know, there's a different yeah, sort of sadistic element to that, and it's something that we wouldn't accept in our real life justice, right? I mean, we would want to see people held accountable in real life, but we wouldn't sort of like, if it was just such a pile-on, right, like a public stoning, right, we would find it too much, right? I mean, we have, a lot of ideas of, things that are ethical and moral, even in the treatment of criminals. I mean, putting aside how messed up the criminal justice system is, we still even think, a lot of times even murderers have some basic level of rights regardless of what they've done. But online, that's sort of even that little basic thing of humanity that we even grant to the worst people in society, right? That, regardless of how much we hate them, that little shred of humanity, something online that's not even there. That doesn't exist.
Yeah, it's just a completely dehumanizing experience that we create for one another when we don't need to. That's the other side of this. And I guess we can take a pause here. I'll get your last thoughts from you, and then we can talk about what we should be talking about instead of cancel culture, right? What online culture can be once we get rid of the accountability and power element, and when we're just left with the online culture element, which is currently can be quite toxic. What it can be instead is something I would like to talk about, and also how we can use the internet for social justice and social movements and the like. And I don't think it's via these toxic engagements with each other. But do you have any last comments on any of this before we break for part 2?
Well, I'm excited to try and figure out a positive new direction, and I hope this conversation was helpful to uh, thinking through some of these questions. And I mean, listen, this is very complicated, and so if you, the students, feel like we missed anything, we're working through this in real time. So, bear with us to try and parse through this complicated dynamic.
Yeah, thank you. That's a very important point. We don't know everything. We just are, academics who also have been very online, just happen to be. And we're trying to learn from this and figure this out too. And I'm sure you can teach us if we said something that didn't feel appropriate or right, then we're very welcome to hearing your comments on that. Thank you very much, Professor Marchia. I'm going to stop this recording now, and we will come back shortly for part 2.